Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to our spring webinar, Insights on Youth Obesity from the ABCD Study from Neurons to Neighborhoods. Today, we'll hear from researchers about the many factors that contribute to unhealthy weight gain and obesity in childhood and adolescence, what the research is showing so far, and what kinds of supports and protective factors can help promote healthy development. After the presentations, we'll open the floor for Q&A, and we're excited to hear your thoughts and questions as part of a rich discussion together. My name is Elizabeth Hoffman. I serve as Associate Director for the ABCD study at the National Institute on Drug Abuse at NIH, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to mention just a few logistics. First, the presentations have been recorded in advance, but the speakers are here with us to answer your questions live, which we'll turn to after the last presentation. You can post your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Spanish interpretation is available. Click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. Closed captioning is also available by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. Text can be turned off or adjusted as needed. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the ABCD website sometime in the next few weeks. As many of you know, ABCD is a long-term study of nearly 12,000 youth across the United States, now completing its 10th year of data collection. Participants started the study when they were 9 or 10 years old, and many are now 19. We're thrilled that some of them and their families have joined us today. This ongoing collaboration has been extraordinary, and we are deeply grateful for their dedication and contributions that have made it possible. So far, nearly 2,000 publications have come out since data were first made available through a secure data platform in 2018. The publications span a broad range of topics and capture many aspects of adolescence, from physical and mental health, substance use, and brain development, to the environments and neighborhoods where youth grow and learn. A key aim of ABCD is to understand how these associations shift across development, since experiences can look very different at different life stages. We are thrilled that participants have continued their involvement as they move into young adulthood, allowing us to learn about how youth grow and change, what shapes their individual paths, and how those paths contribute to long-term outcomes. Today's webinar will highlight recent findings on unhealthy weight gain in youth, including the role of the brain in eating behaviors, as well as genetics, maternal health, lifestyle, and environmental influences that may contribute to obesity risk or protect against it. We'll also hear about how research can inform prevention and intervention efforts. I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists joining us today. Dr. Shana Adis is Assistant Professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Georgia. She studies how weight gain and eating behaviors affect brain development during childhood and adolescence. As a co-investigator of the ABCD study at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, her work seeks to understand why some youth gain weight more easily than others, and how differences in brain structure, cognition, and self-regulation shape eating behavior throughout development. Dr. Susan Carnell is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. She studies the factors that influence appetite and eating behavior across development. Her research focuses on how the brain shapes eating behavior, how parents' feeding behaviors influence children's weight, and how genetic and environmental factors work together to increase risk for obesity. And Dr. Kay Ree is professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. Her research focuses on understanding how parenting practices, eating behaviors, self-regulation, and biological processes interact to shape risk for childhood obesity and eating-related disorders. Using a multidisciplinary approach that spans clinical care and research, Dr. Ree aims to identify early targets for prevention and treatment that support healthy growth and well-being. Dr. Ree also serves as the pediatrics lead for the ABCD study. Thank you to all our speakers for participating in this webinar, and to all of you for attending. We'll hear first from Dr. Adis.
So I'm really excited to tell you about some of our work in the ABCD study data, trying to look at why some kids struggle with weight gain more than others. But first, I want to start off with a simple ask. I want you to think about whether or not you're hungry. Now I want you to think about your favorite food or dessert. Can you describe it to me? How does it look? How does it taste? How does it smell? When's the last time you had it? Was it a pleasant experience? And if I gave you this food right now, would you want to eat it? Is your mouth becoming watery? For those of you who said yes, I just showed you how incredibly easy it is for me to manipulate you to want to eat, even if you're not hungry. And for those who said no, well, you have great self-control. You may be asking how I did this, and to understand this, we need to understand how food intake is regulated, which is controlled by the brain. It tells you to eat when you're hungry and to stop when you're full, and this is very tightly regulated and generally works really well. So this is why you get hungry around the same time of day, and once you eat, the brain tells you to stop. So if you were one of those who was not hungry before the last slide, but your mouth became watery, what I did was I overrode this internal homeostatic control process and I primed you to eat by just using sight, smell, or taste to trigger a bunch of processes in the brain to help you decide whether or not you're going to eat this food. We activated reward by thinking about how much you liked it. Executive control, which may come in later when you decide if you're going to eat the food or not. Any habits you have around the food, what you've learned about it, and how you're currently feeling. And it's okay if you go after this talk and go consume that food. That's 100% normal. But what we think is happening in those who have obesity is that these processes are continuously faulting, causing them to continuously choose poor foods or overeat at a meal, and that's what's contributing to obesity and unhealthy weight gain. This theory comes from a lot of smaller scale studies not collected with ABCD data that have shown that the brain structure looks differently among kids with and without obesity, and even how it functions when at rest. So this is when we have you lie in the rest of the scanner and we say do nothing. We're looking at how the brain communicates from one region to another, and in this case, among regions that control food intake. And we've also seen similar responses in how the brains look when looking at pictures of food as well as receiving actual little amounts of food in the scanner. However, the mechanisms driving this are unknown, and that's because a lot of these earlier studies have included youth with obesity in them, so it hasn't really allowed us to look at what comes first. Are there underlying differences in the brain that predispose some individuals to overeat and gain weight? Or does weight gain itself cause changes to the brain structure and function and thus explain what we've seen so far? Alongside of this, many of the studies have been very small and homogeneous, so they have the same types of people in them, and so they haven't really replicated well when we look at them in different populations. And that's where the power of ABCD really comes in, because you have so many youth from various backgrounds. It's giving us the power to look at these differences to see if there's actually a relationship between the weight and brain. And the longitudinal design of ABCD is also allowing us to evaluate what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So how do we do this? Well, we measure height and weight, and we convert this into a metric called body mass index, or BMI. And we use that to classify individuals into different weight class categories, as you can see here: underweight, healthy weight, overweight, or obese. But you can see that body size can be very different across these different weight classes, and it might be more meaningful to look at a BMI across a continuum, because you can have someone who's healthy weight and they gain 40 pounds in a year, and you can see that that still keeps them in the healthy weight category. And so these categories don't allow us to look at weight gain, but might have more metabolic consequences. So when you hear me talking about this, I'm going to be looking at BMI across the continuum and thinking about this at weight gain rather than whether or not someone has or doesn't have obesity. We use the scanner to look at the brain structure and function, and we also have a whole battery of neurocognitive assessments that help us look at some of these executive functions or decision-making tasks that you may be familiar with. And what we've seen in ABCD is across thousands of youth, those who have greater BMI, there are actually differences in the brain structure, specifically thinner cortices and smaller volumes. And this is concerning because in adults, as we see them getting older, cognitive decline is associated with thinner cortices and smaller volumes. Now, that doesn't mean that these children have cognitive decline, but it could be that we're detecting a risk factor for early onset, meaning that we might see it around age 50 instead of age 80. And we see similar findings when we look at the structure and the function of the brain. So we're looking at this across these different decision-making tasks that are responsible for controlling food intake. And what we see is that greater, inhibitory control or working memory, those are associated with better decision making, but those who have greater BMI, they're actually performing lower on these executive functions. And that might mean combined that these differences in the brain structure are causing weaker communication, leading to poor food decision making, and also setting up to be a risk factor for cognitive decline later in life. However, we still need to answer the question of what comes first. Is it the chicken or the egg? And we can do that. And what we've been doing in ABCD is we've been following a group of youth who at baseline were of a healthy weight. And as you can see by the 2-year follow-up, about 12% of these had unhealthy weight gain and actually started to transition to the unhealthy weight categories, such as had obesity or were overweight. And this helps us get the natural progression and get at these questions of what's coming first, the chicken or the egg. We've looked at this across a few different metrics. So we've looked at the brain volume or the size of different regions associated with food intake, and we've even looked at this at a cellular level as well as behaviorally. And what we found is that from 9 to 12 years old, those who have had greater weight gain during this period, they've had smaller volumes and even differences at the cellular level. So this is really suggesting that, because these kids were of a healthy weight at the start of the study, these differences may exist prior to unhealthy weight gain and be contributing to this. We've also seen this behaviorally when we look at some of our decision-making tasks. So greater impulsivity is linked to greater weight gain across the 2 years among these youth, and that might be leading to poor food in choice. Again, providing more evidence that these differences may exist prior to unhealthy weight gain. We also saw this primarily for girls, and we think that this could be related to puberty because girls, they are undergoing puberty earlier than boys. And we know that pubertal onset, it actually triggers your body to eat more, to gain more weight so that you have enough body fat for reproductive purposes. And also alongside of that, the brain is undergoing maturation during this time. So you're getting rid of connections you no longer need. And that actually increases impulsivity. So these two things combined could be increasing a risk for unhealthy eating, especially given there's so much going on in the environment that might make this worse for some individuals who are more susceptible. So we really think of adolescence now as this very critical period for weight gain risk. However, we also know that the brain is still malleable during this time, so it might be a really good time to intervene and correct anything before we see any negative health consequences or cognitive decline. But you might still be asking, well, what is causing this if there are differences prior to weight gain? We don't really know. It could be many factors, such as you see here. And Dr. Susan Carnell is going to talk to us a little bit about some of these. We also need to understand what's making this worse. And Dr. Kay Ree is going to give us a little insight into that as well, and a little bit about how we can maybe make this better. And before they go on and give their talks, I just want to take a moment here to thank everyone who's helped contribute to some of the work that I've presented to you here today, as well as my funders. And you can find out more about what our lab does by looking at our website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi everyone, happy to be here with you today. So Shana has given you a great overview of what ABCD has taught us about the role of the brain in influencing what you weigh. Now I'd like to talk a bit about the influences in early life that might be affecting our brain's eating behavior and weight. I have one disclosure of some research support from Eli Lilly for a study I won't talk about today. So, as you just learned, our brains play a crucial role in influencing our body weight in early adolescence. And that's likely because our brains influence our behavior, including our eating behavior. What I want to tell you about in this talk is how genetic factors can influence our body weight by impacting our brains and our eating behavior, and how maternal factors like maternal weight and metabolism during pregnancy can play an additional role, but also how healthy home environments and early interventions during infancy may be able to mitigate the effects of genetic and maternal factors on obesity risk. And first, I want to talk about genetics. So we've known for a long time that body weight is strongly genetically influenced. We know this from twin studies, where we see that identical twins, because of their identical genes, often end up with extremely similar body weights, and are much more similar in weight than non-identical twins who only share about half of their genes. But what we've learned more recently is that part of the reason why identical twins end up similar in weight is because their genes also make them similar in their eating behavior, which shows us that eating behavior is also highly genetically influenced. This is true for what we call food approach behaviors, like food responsiveness, which is the drive to eat in response to food stimuli like the sight or smell of food, and tends to be associated with higher body weight, and also for what we call food avoidant behaviors like satiety responsiveness, which refers to how sensitive you are to internal cues triggering you to stop eating, like fullness signals released by hormones in the gut, and tends to be associated with lower body weight. We can see this from studies of eating behaviors in twins in middle childhood, and we can also see it in studies of feeding behaviors of twins in infancy during the milk feeding stage. What studies like ABCD are starting to show us is that part of the way genes are influencing our eating behavior and our weight is actually by influencing how the brain develops. For example, this study in ABCD showed that genetic risk for obesity was associated with differences in the temporal cortex, which is an early developing area of the brain important for many sensory and cognitive functions, and also in the frontal cortex, which is a later developing area, which we know to be particularly important for inhibitory control and which houses the brain's braking system. And these differences in the brain were associated with more impulsive behaviors, which were in turn associated with increased weight 1 year later. Now, ABCD starts in early adolescence, but it's also important to investigate impacts early in life because if we see changes happening earlier, we might want to intervene earlier. And we can see from data from Resonance, which is a cohort beginning in infancy, that genetic obesity risk may also be associated with differences in the nucleus accumbens, which is a region deep inside the brain that we know to be important for experiencing reward and motivation, which you can think of as your brain's go-get-it system. Next, I want to talk about maternal factors. And two factors we know to be quite important for predicting child weight outcomes are higher maternal weight, particularly pre-pregnancy weight and weight during pregnancy, and also maternal health during pregnancy. For example, gestational diabetes, which is a condition where the body finds it harder to use insulin properly and blood glucose levels become very high. High maternal weight and gestational diabetes influence the intrauterine environment and are known to be associated with higher child weight, waist circumference, and body fat. What studies like ABCD are now teaching us is how exactly maternal factors like this might be affecting brain circuits in the child. And if you have a good memory, you might recognize these brain areas from earlier, because what this study found was that maternal gestational diabetes, much like genetic obesity risk, was associated with differences in the temporal cortex and the frontal cortex. And these brain differences were in turn associated with child weight. One thing that ABCD can't really tell us, though, is what these brain areas are doing differently so as to influence child weight. However, in studies where we scan adolescents' brains while showing them food stimuli like food pictures or food words, what we find is that whereas adolescents whose moms have healthy weight show robust responses in the frontal cortex, as shown here in the red and yellow, adolescents whose moms have overweight do not show these responses, as you can see by how different this second picture looks. And what this suggests is that higher maternal weight may be associated with a relative lack of engagement of frontal inhibitory control circuits in response to food stimuli in children. So to put all of this together, what we're seeing from ABCD and other studies is that early life factors like genetic obesity risk and maternal weight and metabolism are associated with differences across multiple parts of the brain, including the brain's braking system, which may be underactive, and the brain's go-get-it system, which may be overactive. And we think these influences are working together in some children to increase the risk of less healthy eating patterns in terms of both amount and type of food, and thereby increasing their risk of obesity. So where does this leave us? Does it mean that children who have genetic obesity risk and who were exposed to higher maternal weight or gestational diabetes are destined to make poor food choices and develop obesity? The answer to this is definitely no. And in the last part of my talk, I want to give you two examples of this. So the first example illustrates the importance of the home environment. What this study did was to compare the effect of genetic obesity risk on child weight in homes which were considered high obesity risk with homes which were considered low in obesity risk. So in high obesity risk homes, high calorie snacks were available, visible, and accessible. Parents were more likely to offer food to their child to increase positive emotions or to reward good behavior, and children had lots of screen time. The study found that in these homes, if children had high genetic risk for obesity, there was a higher chance this would be associated with high child weight. Whereas in low risk homes, fruits and vegetables were available, visible, and accessible. Parents were more likely to model and encourage healthy foods and monitor access to less healthy ones. And children had more opportunities and support for physical activity. And the study found that in these homes, if children had high genetic risk for obesity, there was much less chance that this would be associated with high child weight. The second example illustrates how parents may be able to help mitigate obesity risk even earlier in life. So in this study from Penn State, research nurses delivered a responsive parenting intervention beginning in infancy that included education around responsive feeding, such as how to recognize and respond appropriately to the infant's hunger and satiety cues, and also how to give age-appropriate portions of healthy foods. The intervention also contained advice on sleep, play, and emotion regulation, and I refer you to the link in the bottom right corner if you'd like to know more details about this intervention and others like it. What this study found is that by 3 years of age, children in the responsive parenting group had significantly lower body weight. And this is not the only study to suggest that interventions to promote responsive parenting and feeding in infancy may be able to help reduce obesity risk. So to summarize what I've talked about today, I hope I've persuaded you that genetic factors influence weight, eating behaviors, and brain appetite circuits in children. Maternal weight and metabolic factors are also associated with child weight and brain appetite circuits. And these biological factors may make it more challenging for some children to maintain a healthy weight. But biology is not destiny. So brain circuits, behavior, and weight are all malleable, and future waves of ABCD will be really valuable in helping us understand how and why these related factors change in children over time. And most important to remember, we already know that positive home environments and healthy lifestyle behaviors are capable of modifying the effects of genetic risk and early life factors on weight trajectories, which means that successful obesity prevention and treatment is possible despite the presence of biological risk factors. So now I'll go ahead and thank the participants, the scientists, and funding sources that have helped to generate the insights we've talked about today, and hand over to my colleague, Dr. Ree, who is going to tell you much more about the power of environments and behaviors, and also touch on what we know works in terms of treatment.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the last portion of this webinar and talk to you about lifestyle behaviors, neighborhood, and the social environment. So what we've heard a lot about so far from Drs. Adis and Carnell have really focused on what I consider the internal factors that are affecting obesity risk. And so they talked a lot about genetics and biology, what our brain looks like, how our cognitive functionings are potentially affecting this. And that's been really important to understand our internal risks for obesity. ABCD also, though, has a lot of important information about the neighborhood, the social context, and the lifestyle behaviors that we engage in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So let's start with lifestyle behaviors. So in terms of lifestyle behaviors, what we're finding in ABCD kind of mirrors what other groups have found in other studies, that basically unhealthy lifestyle behaviors are associated with greater weight status. And we're seeing this with a lot of different behaviors. So we're seeing this with lower step counts or lower physical activity. We also see this if kids are engaging in higher screen time. And then also if they have shorter sleep duration or later bedtimes. And now it's really interesting when you think about these lifestyle behaviors, though, is that these don't exist in isolation. For example, like if somebody is engaging in a lot of screen time, they're probably going to bed a little bit later. They're probably not getting a lot of sleep and maybe also not engaging in a lot of physical activity. So really, when we're considering these behavioral factors, we need to kind of consider them together and look at how they interact with each other. So one group did this. Jason Nagata's group up in San Francisco really tried to look at the interaction between physical activity or low step counts and screen time. And what they did here was stratify the groups into those kids who are engaging in low, medium, or high screen time, and then also looking at whether they were engaging in low physical activity, medium physical activity, which is in this green dotted area, and high physical activity, which is in the dark blue area. And what we're seeing here that essentially, no matter how much screen time you're engaging in, if you're not engaging in a lot of physical activity, so you're having low physical activity, less than 6,000 steps a day, your risk for having increasing BMI percentiles is much higher than compared to those who are engaging in more physical activity. And what we see here is that these kids, no matter how much screen time they're engaging in, if they're not engaging in physical activity, they're gaining about 3 or 4 BMI percentile points over the 2-year period. And this was significantly greater than compared to those kids who are engaging in a lot of physical activity. All right, so let's move on to the neighborhood factors now. So again, in ABCD, there are a lot of neighborhood variables or variables that characterize the neighborhoods in which our children are living. And so instead of looking at each factor individually, it's really more ideal to kind of put all of these factors together and create these indices. So one of these indices is something called the Childhood Opportunity Index. And this is a 29-item population health indicator, which looks at the characteristics of the neighborhood or census tract in which our children live. And so they're looking at things like the educational level in the neighborhood, high school graduation rates, whether there are grocery stores or parks in the neighborhood, what is the employment rate or the home ownership rate in these neighborhoods. And they can characterize then almost all the neighborhoods or census tracts around the country. And this map is just one example of this. And you can see here that those in the higher childhood opportunity index areas, which is indicated by this dark blue, are really more located on both coasts and around a lot of the metropolitan areas. And then in contrast, we see those with very low childhood opportunity index scores in this lighter blue, and you're seeing these areas pop up more in the rural areas and in the South. And so in general, when you're looking at childhood opportunity index, we see that there are better health outcomes if children are living in these areas that have higher childhood opportunity. And we see that with obesity prevalence as well, too. So in the areas that have the lowest childhood opportunity, up to 31% of children, and in this study, particularly in girls, are experiencing obesity. And you can contrast this to those areas that have higher childhood opportunity, where only about 7%, 6.9% of girls in those areas are reported to have obesity. Now, similar to the Childhood Opportunity Index, there's something called the social determinants of health. And these are the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. And these include a lot of the community, neighborhood level factors that we just talked about, but also look at some of the more personal or family level factors that may be influencing your risk factor for health outcomes. And so here we're looking at things like what is your family's income level, whether your family is experiencing food insecurity or not, what's your access to health facilities, whether you have a lot of social support, things like that. And again, the greater adversity or the more adverse social determinants of health you're experiencing, typically the worse the health outcomes. And we see this with physical activity. So those kids who were experiencing more adverse social determinants of health were engaging in less physical activity per day, three days versus 4 days, and also had a higher BMI, a BMI of 20 versus 18. One other kind of social context factor that I wanted to mention is something called the adverse childhood experiences. And so these adverse childhood experiences are really the more severe or traumatic experiences that a child might experience. And so these are things like physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, whether or not there's drug abuse in your family, whether the child is witnessing domestic violence or there's somebody who's incarcerated in the family. So these are pretty severe experiences. And what we're seeing in ABCD is that about 15% of the youth are experiencing 4 or more adverse childhood events. And as you experience more adverse childhood events, the BMI characteristic for these people are higher. So kids who are experiencing only no adverse events or 1 adverse events have on average a BMI of 20. And you can see this increases as you're increasing the number of adverse events you're experiencing, up to a point where these kids who are experiencing 8 or more adverse events have a BMI of about 25. Now, one thing this study also did was to look at some of the protective factors which may decrease the risk of obesity for these kids. And what they found, particularly among Latino youth, was that those children with greater self-coping skills or self-regulation skills, as well as those families where the caregiver was receiving a lot of social support, those kids actually had lower BMI. And so this is really interesting now because it helps us think about what are the areas that we could potentially target as we're thinking about interventions for childhood obesity. So I wanted to show this slide. This is the social ecological model. And I really like this slide because it kind of puts together everything we've been talking about over, the 3 of us over the past 30 minutes here. And so it really highlights how all of these different levels of influence are interrelated and sort of all together impacting our risk for childhood obesity. So you see here in blue some of the more personal or biologic events, characteristics that Dr. Adis and Carnell talked about. We also see here in purple some of the more behavioral factors, so things like physical activity, screen time, dietary intake. In green, we see some of the family level factors I talked about. And then in yellow, we see some of the community level factors. And all of these can be points of intervention that people have tried to address. And I'm just going to end here because we don't have a lot of time to talk about the different interventions, but a lot of the interventions really focus on this interpersonal level. And these are just some of the studies that I've engaged in with my team here at UC San Diego, where we really target family behaviors, lifestyle behaviors, and try to help people engage in more healthy behaviors. Now, we saw, though, there's a lot of influence from the neighborhood and social context, and there are groups, including ourselves, who are trying to address some of these as well. So things like access to good foods, access to better neighborhood green spaces and things like that. And then finally, there are groups, including ourselves as well, who are looking at some of the adverse childhood events and thinking about what kind of interventions we can develop to decrease the impact of those things and creating more social support for the families, as well as teaching them some parenting skills to maybe decrease the impact of some of these negative childhood events. So I'm going to end here, and I just want to acknowledge our group here at CHEER, the Center for Healthy Eating and Activity Research, and thank you all for joining.